Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Tom Alves, I'm the Head of Development at AHURI and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest event in our AHURI Research Webinar Series. I want to begin today by acknowledging that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all are joining us from today, and also to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to lands and waters across Australia. AHURI is pleased to be able to offer this research webinar series as a means of keeping you informed of our latest research and to help you engage with research findings from our ongoing program of research. At a time, of course, when our public face-to-face conference and events program is on hold. And so today will be our 10th instalment in the series. If you are interested in our previous webinars, the recordings of these are all freely available on the AHURI website. Before we meet today's presenters and I introduce you to the topic of today's webinar, I want to take a moment to introduce you to AHURI's revamped COVID-19 Research Hub, which is now live and available through our website. We created this hub back in March as a platform to host relevant news and also our own analysis of key policy decisions relating to housing, homelessness, and cities in response to the pandemic. We also commissioned the COVID-19 Research Agenda. This was 8 rapid research projects to answer some of the most pressing policy questions. I'm very pleased to say that 4 of the reports have been published so far, including the latest project, which examines post-pandemic landlord-renter relationships in Australia, which was released yesterday and is available through the website. Please do visit the Hub to see this report and an array of other interesting content that relates to COVID-19. And of course, the 2 presenters that we have today and the 2 projects we'll be hearing about are also commissioned as part of the COVID-19 Research Agenda, and the full reports can be accessed and downloaded via AHURI's COVID-19 Research Hub. And just on the question of downloads, I will take a moment to mention, I believe there's been a bit of a problem with some of the handouts for today's webinar. And if that's the case, then we can make those available, and we will do so as links in the email that you'll receive following the webinar. And of course, the material is available on the website for you to access either now or at any time. Okay, before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I need to provide you with a few instructions regarding the software that we're using, and also to do a bit of quick housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so if you do want to return to it later, or if you want to forward it on to a colleague, the recording will be available on AHURI's website either later today or in coming days. At the end of today's webinar, you will receive a survey, and we really do welcome your feedback because it helps us refine and improve future webinars and ensures that we're presenting information that is useful to you. In terms of participating in today's webinar, here are a few instructions. You're listening by default using your computer's speaker system. If you would prefer to join by telephone, you can do that. Just select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed for you to access. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions today by typing them in the questions section of the control panel, and I do encourage you to do that. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentations today, and we'll collate these and we'll seek to address as many of them as we possibly can during the Q&A segment that follows the presentations today. Please disregard, though, the raise your hand function in the dashboard, as we won't be using that. Now, to today's topic and today's presenters. I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar today. It's called Housing Policy Responses to COVID-19. Our presenters are Dr. Chris Mason from Swinburne University of Technology and Professor Stephen Rowley from Curtin University in Western Australia. Chris is the lead author of AHURI's report, Policy Coordination and Housing Outcomes During COVID-19, which is one of the two reports that are forming the basis of the webinar today. This report analysed the scale and range of policy interventions in the housing system during the pandemic, a critical first step for ongoing assessment of the outcomes and impacts of the initiatives that governments have deployed in response to COVID-19. Stephen, on the other hand, is the lead author of AHURI's report, Responding to the Pandemic, Can Building Homes Rebuild Australia? This report examines the government stimulus measures that have been directed at the housing industry since the beginning of the pandemic and what other stimulus may be required as we continue towards economic recovery. Both reports, along with policy evidence summaries and the standalone executive summaries, are now available at the AHURI website. As I say, they are also available, or some of them are at the moment, as handouts through the webinar, and those that aren't will be made available afterwards. Our first speaker, Chris Mason, is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Social Impact and also the Course Director for the PhD by Practice-Based Research at the Swinburne University of Technology. Chris is Australia's research field leader in ethics and is recognised as a global leader in social enterprise research. He studies the complex relationships between entrepreneurs, organisations and policymakers to understand how they foster and constrain social innovation. Our second speaker, Stephen Rowley, is the Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute's Curtin Research Centre. Stephen has been active in the areas of affordable housing and housing affordability research for the last 20 years, covering both the UK and Australia. He has delivered research for numerous organisations, including the UK government, the Irish government, the European Union, the Bankwest Curtin Economics Centre, the Department of Housing in Western Australia, the Western Australian Council of Social Services, and of course, AHURI. Today, we also welcome Tanya Steinbeck as a respondent following the research presentations. Welcome, Tanya. Tanya is the CEO of the Western Australian branch of the Urban Development Institute of Australia. Tanya has more than 20 years experience in the property and urban development industry across the private, government and not-for-profit sectors. The format for today's webinar will include the two research presentations, which will run back to back, and that will be followed by Tanya's response. After that, I will facilitate a discussion with each of the three participants and we'll take questions from the audience. So please do feel free to ask your questions and please start asking them at any time during the presentations, and I'll do my best to include them in the Q&A that follows the formal part of the session. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first presenter, Dr. Chris Mason. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Before I commence, I'd like to echo your acknowledgement of country and that I also present from the ancestral lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emergent. I'd also like to thank AHURI for putting a lot of support into developing these research projects, not just my own, of course, at a critical time for Australia and the Australian housing system, and I'm sure that we'll have a very vibrant debate once Stephen and I have both finished our presentations. And I should also flag that that very generous introduction you gave me, of course I wrote it, which was no surprise then. But I suppose it seems quite unusual that a person who looks at the interface between entrepreneurship, organisations and policy should look at the housing system. But the reality is that looking at any one of those interfaces really deals with complexity and ambiguity. And because of COVID and because of a long-standing interest and work in the housing system in Australia through work with AHURI, I've become fascinated by the complexities of the system and how it works and where it might not work so well. So when this opportunity came up, it gave me a line of sight to really dig deeper into how policy action occurs during a crisis And what does that mean? So my presentation might be slightly unorthodox for these kind of webinars. I'm happy to be disabused of that notion. But as I go through, what I'm really trying to do is show how we made sense of a rapidly unfolding story and what that story looks like, but what it also means. So there'll be some numbers, but mostly this is about what happened and where did it happen and where did it not happen. And so hopefully that brings everyone who's part of the audience today and my fellow panelists along that journey, and we can have some really interesting discussion following that. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, as we all know, and we're living through it, the project arose out of an awareness that there was an awful lot of policy making that had to happen in a very short space of time, unprecedented space of time, given the very critical and deleterious effects that the COVID pandemic was having on the lives of all of us. It affects everybody. But of course, as we know, the housing system is also rife with inequities and inequalities. And so part of our approach was to understand how does that policy making and the work of various non-policy but relevant, of course, industry actors and people who are working on the front line delivering services, how are they intending and how do they come together to create the sort of impacts that we need them to have to reduce those inequities and inequalities during a time of crisis. And we're aware, of course, that those impacts happen across the housing continuum and within groups within that continuum. So it's intensely complex and very challenging. And I've never experienced in any of the countries I've lived and worked in, of course, any kind of political activity such as that we've witnessed over the past 7 or 8 months. It's just unheralded. And hopefully you get a sense of how we've analysed it and whether those outcomes that we've arrived at are hopefully solid and helpful and constructive to moving the conversation forward. So unapologetically, I'm taking a bird's eye view of the entire housing response to the crisis. And of course, the remaining presentation in this session and the other presentations take a closer view on individual aspects of that continuum. And the final bit of framing, until I get on with it properly, relates to we try to understand the complexity through a few lenses around the degree to which it was coordinated, how it was communicated, which is a key component of trying to understand the flow through of policy making into implementation. And of course, as part of that implementation, the level and degree of collaboration that was flagged through particular, well, every single policy announcement over a period of time. Next slide, please. So as leading on from that, we were driven really by 3 core questions. Unsurprisingly, the first one is, what were the initiatives that were announced between the period of around March and June 2020 related to intervening in the housing system? What were the policies announced or policy changes, and what reforms at a regulatory level were there developed at both the federal and state government levels? So naturally, for a scoping study, that's a rather broad net, very wide net. So we began by really acknowledging that this is happening so fast that we really don't know. We're running just to catch up and capture the data to help us understand what has been proposed and what that might mean. Our second question deals more pertinently with the how question, looking at those existing and emergent policies and any related activities, and what are they going to do? What do they say they will do to address negative housing outcomes? And of course, this runs the risk of saying, well, the negative housing outcomes were caused by the crisis. Of course, we recognize that many of those inequities and inequalities were exacerbated by the crisis and existed long before COVID, or indeed my own time in Australia was around. So I think we also recognize that by trying to understand at a closer level, not just what, but also the processes for the process for how policy was established, created, communicated, and implemented. And lastly, although this isn't the end of the story, a real focus on something I've already touched on, I suppose, is the coordination between levels of government and across sectors. So we realized from the get-go that this is a very complex but whole system, in the sense that you have a variety of government agencies and actors that are very influential in the housing system, and there are also non-government actors that are critical to the proper running of that system, or the effective running of that system. So the net started quite broad and ended up getting extremely broad, probably way too broad, but we needed to get as much breadth of coverage as we possibly could. And in that way, of course, that's how you scope what's happening, scoping the terms of the story that I hopefully will describe to you over the next few slides. Next slide, please, Katerina. So how did we do it? Well, I don't want to become very boring. I appreciate webinars. Sometimes you really need to bring them alive. I did a systematic review. It's pretty hard to bring that to life in a webinar, but I'll try. It's the only way of doing a really solid and authoritative scoping is to apply a systematic and rigorous methodology. And so we used a systematic search approach to capture the materials that related to policy measures and interventions across Australia and across the housing continuum. So again, we realized that the only way of navigating it would be to employ a systematic approach. So we've done this a few times using what's called the PRISMA method, and that is a very structured, rigorous, deliberative approach to capture data using a definitive search string, which you go out there and use on databases like Capital Monitor. You capture the data, and then iteratively you work through that with a set of coding criteria to make sure that you're actually getting the correct information from the correct sources. In this case, it was governmental departments across levels of government and so on, to make sure that you were getting the information about those policies and relevant interventions. But of course, you'll understand that at the time, and I've already mentioned at least 15 times, that we were really running hard to catch up with the pace of change. This wasn't formal policy in terms of policy documentation. Things were happening so rapidly that we relied on official media releases and policy announcements to guide us in understanding the scoping for each part of the housing continuum and what would be contained in it. So our data set, our set of materials, related to only those official announcements from the relevant government departments and authorities and agencies that gave us the information. So the what question, very much so. And certainly in terms of who the intended beneficiaries for that intervention were, how much money was being committed. And I think, and this will probably come up in the questions, I'm sure, so I don't want to head it off with a blithe comment, but it wasn't all necessarily new funding either. A lot of this funding was already earmarked, so we had to try and distinguish between funding that was already allocated for particular interventions but was fast-tracked or expedited, and then added to potentially with new funding at either state or federal government level. So I hopefully have given you a little bit of insight into the kind of complexity that was involved in unraveling some of the data that form part of our story of this crisis on the housing system. Just as an added aside, we collected our data, but in the interests of transparency and also collaboration, we've hosted all of our data on Analysis and Policy online, and I've included a link that no one can click on because I've obviously forgotten that no one can interact with the link, but it is there and I'm happy to share it after the fact. It's a useful resource, at least I think so. It's an organic resource that means that as definitive policy comes along, we can add to that, and that becomes a resource for all interested parties who want to explore the effects or the policy-making interventions during the COVID crisis on Australia. So, and it's been very interesting to see the uptake and interest in that already. So I encourage you, self-interest to one side, to explore that. That would be great. So building on the systematic approach, of course, it wasn't just about collecting documents, we had to interpret them. So we performed an interpretive policy analysis, such as it was, on all those announcements to understand the degree of coordination between levels of government, or where the locus of control, if you like, lies for any particular announcement. So the emphasis here is trying to add depth to what could be, I hopefully have portrayed it not as a dry approach. It's about getting a comprehensive data set, but then it's making sense of the data and then narrating that back into the bigger story. So we applied a structured and rigorous coding approach to the data across 3 different coders. So we had 3 different perspectives on what the data means. And then we, of course, through discussion and dialogue, we winnowed that down to a small set of codes that we were able to classify. And I'll talk about some of those a little bit later, but that's way too much on our approach. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the next few slides are very similar, but what we were able to construct at a really descriptive level, but I think it's quite visually impactful, and thank you to AHURI for helping us with the graphic design, is across the time period of our study, which focused on between March and June this year, we located the date of particular announcements for level of government and on the housing continuum. So hopefully you can see that clearly, that in the very first sort of major month of interventions, which was March, we've got a lot of activity going on at very different levels of government. So for example, just scanning across that, you can see there's a smattering of homelessness interventions at federal and state level. We've got social housing at the get-go, which, as we will discuss later, relates to upgrades and maintenance. So the first part of this story is, what were the priorities, I guess, I'm trying to say there. And it's pretty much every, or at least 5 of the housing continuum outcome areas around housing and homelessness. And of course, we'll talk about rough sleepers a bit later, crisis accommodation for victims, or sorry, I should say survivors and families of domestic violence through emergency accommodation, and a whole raft of other interventions. So very, very active across levels of government from the get-go. And next slide to April, please. And now you see that the rate of interventions really intensifies as government becomes aware of the severity of the global health crisis and its effect on the wider system. And we've got a lot more about crisis accommodation, home ownership, assisted home ownership, which I'll leave to Stephen, and a lot more on private rental around rent relief at the state level and moratoria on evictions and so on. So we can see that March and April, there are a very large number of rapidly deployed policy interventions and activities and measures to try and arrest the obviously looming social crisis emerging from COVID. Next slide. As we get to May, they thin out, because clearly the whole of government approach to the interventions was to hit hard and hit effectively and throw enough resources behind it to hopefully, as we'll discuss a little bit later, might I say later in about 3 minutes time, in more detail. So making sure that the punch is there to get the interventions in, a lot of them and a lot of support, and a whole of government approach by and large. So by May, we're really looking at more home ownership initiatives, and I think it was around May that Home Builder, could have been early June actually, Home Builder was announced with some of the other measures, and ongoing commitments to increasing supply in social housing and upgrades and maintenance and so on. And of course, as part of that story, you'll probably recall, well, you should recall the social housing emergency in Victoria around that time, and a lot of the rapidly deployed upgrades and maintenance announcements that were made as a consequence, potentially as a consequence of that. And finally, June, next slide, please. And obviously towards the end of this period, and this isn't to say that all interventions have stopped, that's not true, we just had to cut off at some stage, and we have a very similar slowing down of interventions as the effects of the earlier phase of the crisis and those moves have been seen, and more again on focusing on upgrades and maintenance for social housing, and some assisted home ownership, first home ownership schemes were started to be announced. So I guess the overall bird's eye view is a lot going on, but very deeply concentrated in the first 2 real months of the crisis on the home housing system, which was around March and April, but a continued flow-through effect of seeking to understand how far this crisis is going to go and how deeply it will affect the system. So I'll just flip to the next slide. I'm running a little short on time. So as an example, and I've taken this from our report, just to give you a bit more detail of the kind of interventions that were rolled out in the early phases. On the demand side, we've put in a few there around rentals, such as income support for low-income renters, and through the rental assistance payments to low-income private renters. And of course, around home purchase, first homer assistance, as we flagged. On the supply side and on the regulation side, we've also focused on rental as an example to show there was also direct provision of public housing through the National Housing and Homelessness Agreements and the predecessor programs, and through regulatory moves such as regulation on landlord and tenant relations, which was really rolled out more effectively through obviously state-based residential tenancies legislation, but was supported at a federal level. So our purpose there is to say, look, there's the timeline, there's a chronology in the unfolding of events, but then there's another layer of depth that says, but this is also in terms of what's demand side, supply side, and what regulation can and would be changed in the short term, but perhaps also exposing some future work that needs to be done to shore up some of those gaps in provision. So next slide. And just as an overview, here is so $4.08 billion committed across housing outcomes across levels of government, and we've broken that down. There is a caveat to that. Stephen's probably going to throw something at my screen. Assisted home ownership, we flagged it was 817 million committed, but that takes into account the announcement of Home Builder as well. So that's not quite a true measure of or a granular analysis of things like assisted home ownership, and we make that clear in our report. But that's not our primary focus. Between the timescale that we looked at, that happened towards the end of our time frame, so we didn't really have a chance to factor that in, and I'll leave that to others to go into detail. But you can see, other than social housing, where the federal government, for reasons that we understand, don't commit to a national financial fiscal intervention in that space, there was a lot of activity nonetheless, up to 1.57 billion, which was largely concentrated around Victoria and New South Wales, and across the board, huge interventions, a lot of money thrown towards it in a very quick, rapidly unfolding time frame. Next slide, please. So, but what does this mean? And I'm not a numbers guy. I'm quite happy to flag that numbers only tell part of the story. And that once we've done that level of analysis and we traced that series of stories, we realized that then the relationships and collaborations between levels of government and service providers, for example, and policy actors more generally, they matter deeply to what the numbers actually mean. So what is the potential for coordination, effective and appropriate interventions here? That's revealed through our responses to the crisis. And also there's an evaluative aspect that's not necessarily covered, and it isn't covered. That's because given the rush of activity, what do we know about the impacts of the lives of people within that system? Well, we get an idea. So for example, and I talk about this on the next slide, so apologies, but the virtual elimination of rough sleeping in Melbourne in a very, very short time frame gives an indication that there were clearly very significant impacts from mobilizing policy actors and resources and service providers in a very short time frame. It made a real impact. So it leads to further questions for us. And what are those processes, and what do we learn about the wider system and how it works? So probably more questions than we can satisfy in a scoping study. Probably less the bird's eye view, more like the worm's eye view, which is also something we should probably discuss. We found there were strengths to multi-level governance through the process, and I've flagged that, but the communication of how that works. So we were looking at, I suppose, from official announcements, the messaging about what that means. And so that for us was really all about the importance of working together and the high degree of urgency on not just the obviously direct impacts on the system and on people's lives and well-being, but the indirect impacts. And so we might see that more through assistance in the private rental sector for interventions to help support people pay their rent or avoid eviction in the case of their employment being highly precarious. Next slide, please. And so through our report, we've got a vignette for each of the housing areas we looked at. So I'll just touch on these a little bit, but I've already mentioned in Victoria, the response to rough sleeping was admirable and effective in the terms of providing temporary housing, launched this Housing Rough Sleeper initiative, and the various processes involved in that, which I think was successful from an outsider looking in, and the commitment of funding for long-term housing solutions. I think that was very good, of course. And we have examples from New South Wales in terms of increasing social housing supply. The Planning System Acceleration Programme already seemed to have been getting some traction in encouraging applications through that system. And maintaining residential tenancies, I nearly said tendencies, but there we go, in terms of legislation change, and my WA colleagues will, I'm happy to be corrected, freeze on household fees, for example, energy assistance payments, so direct and indirect ways of capturing that implementation. I'm running short of time, so next slide, probably the last slide. So what comes next? Well, as I said, we took a very bird's eye view to this. It is broad, and it frames the other projects in the sense that it does a lot of the background narrative framing of what happened when. But there is a need for a longer term worm's eye view of what this actually means to policy and practice. We've got an indication that policy making happens very effectively in areas such as we've seen in tackling crisis accommodation for rough sleepers, but also survivors of domestic family violence. And there are interventions that worked, in a way that perhaps observers of the system may not have expected it to work so well. I don't know. But that was a huge opportunity to learn from that through an evaluation framework, a very robust one, to understand from various positions within the system what worked and what worked well and what worked less well. Of course, what it also did is expose gaps, huge gaps. So the underinvestment in the supply of social housing from across the board, you could say, wasn't a COVID phenomenon. That's longer term. And the two sides we recognise as an opportunity is firstly to recognise the need for longer term investment in the supply of social housing, which a shortage was massively exposed through the crisis. But also that's not to downplay the fact that supplying houses is not the cause of the problem. There are deeper underlying problems around social inequality and economic inequality and inequity in our country that force people into positions where they need to rely on the supply. So there are deeper factors that this research doesn't touch on, but I wanted to make it clear that although we see that social housing supply is a critical problem, it's not the only part of that problem, and it's a very complex and challenging space within which to work. So I've probably talked too long there. I'd like to thank you for your attention and kind patience, and I'll close my presentation there.
Thank you very much, Chris. We really appreciate that really thorough overview of your research project. We now go straight to Professor Stephen Rowley at Curtin University, who's going to present his project. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Chris. I thought that was excellent, really, really interesting. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land as well, the Noongar people, and to their elders past, present and emerging. So this project, really the focus is what could be done with the housing industry to try and support the economic recovery. So housing has traditionally been a very effective mechanism for generating outputs and outcomes in the economy. And clearly COVID was going to impact on the housing industry, particularly in the early days through job losses, through the inability to get on site, through home opens, that sort of thing. So we were looking at, well, what could be done to actually help the housing industry to rebuild the economy. We started this in, I think, probably May, so it was kind of before the major intervention, so it kept having to sort of reinvent the project a little bit, and we produced it in August. So there's a few things happened post this report, and perhaps findings might have been a little bit different had we been writing it in October, but I think generally our findings are still applicable. So if we go to the first slide, please. So I'd like to thank my co-authors as well. As I say, this was done pretty quickly, so I was very heavily reliant on my co-authors who are listed there. That's the report. There's somebody touching a screen. Hopefully it's to accept another home builder application and to get another house off the ground. But we were looking at really why should you use the house building industry to stimulate an economic recovery. Also, what's happened internationally, and sort of a little comparison with international responses to Australia. Obviously, we looked at the stimulus measures to date, particularly those that really were used to support additional housing construction leading obviously to jobs. We also asked, well, okay, so we've got the home builder in place and various state level measures, but are we going to need additional industry support going forward to protect jobs and to really generate that economic recovery? And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about implications for government. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so why would you use housing to stimulate the economy? Firstly, it's about creating direct and indirect jobs. So the MBA have come up, and most policy lobby groups, housing lobby groups, including UDI, have come up with measures to prove that the housing industry is a very effective way of stimulating the economy, both through direct and indirect jobs. NIFIC, National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, looked at or did some modelling as well to look at the multiplier effect of housing investment, so around about 2.9. So for every $1 you inject into The building industry, you get $2.9 return through those direct and indirect jobs, the spending that you get on top of the actual construction. And our research, our analysis of ABS data showed that certainly non-residential construction, residential construction infrastructure had a really high multiplier effect when it comes to the recovery of those hardest hit sectors, such as tourism and retail. So spending in those areas does have a knock-on effect in those hardest hit areas. So the case is pretty clear that if you support the housing industry, it does have a knock-on effect to the rest of the economy. And of course, housing has been used before to stimulate the economy. Post-World War II, massive house building program, which created jobs and also delivered places for people to live. And then the GFC response was pretty significant as well. In particular, the social housing initiative, 5.64 billion of federal government money. And I noticed on Chris's slide a little dash where it came to the Commonwealth's spending on social housing. A little bit different from 2008 with that 5.64 billion. Also, they pumped money into the first homeowner boost as well, and the energy efficient home package. So we can argue all we like about the effectiveness of those packages, but there was $10 billion worth of federal funds going into support and stimulate the housing industry and provide social housing. Next slide. So there's just a summary of those federal and state stimulus measures to support new build housing to really increase demand from consumers. Now, when you're supporting the housing industry, well, the demand side is important because the housing industry are delivering housing for private sector consumers by and large. So if you've got no demand from private sector consumers, well, the building industry have got nothing to deliver. Hence, the home builder grant providing $25,000 incentive for people to build new housing, and then boosts in Western Australia, Tasmania and Northern Territories to provide additional support for households looking to build. Add on top of those the first home buyer grants and stamp duty concessions, and then you're looking at a really significant demand side incentive for an awful lot of people. I think the industry were very supportive of both home builder and home building boosts, but particularly in Western Australia, there was no income limit to the home building boost. So that really broadened the number of people that were actually eligible for that subsidy. So I don't think there's any surprise that there was a bigger uptake in certain states because of the actual level of demand side incentives put forward by both federal and state government. Next slide. So in addition, the federal government have extended the first home loan deposit scheme, which will produce some new dwellings over time. It is targeted at new build, which is a sensible move. $1 billion extra for NIFIC, and NIFIC have been doing a good job working with community housing providers and others in delivering supply, but again, it's a pretty small amount of money compared to a previous intervention at the GFC. And the states have been very active, as Chris identified, particularly around that the social housing. There's actually some new social housing development coming out of the states, but obviously there's a limit to what they can afford to provide. Planning reform has been on the table as well, trying to accelerate development approvals and new schemes. Again, it's knock-on effects for the economy. Stamp duty reform in certain locations as well, again, to try and increase demand. And then in New South Wales, that tax reform for build to rent around land tax. Obviously, we'd like to see a bit more of that around the country, but again, providing the sort of conditions for institutions to invest money into residential housing. Next slide. Internationally, you can read there some of the responses in various countries. A lot of them have been around affordable and social housing. Even the UK have been looking at pumping in money to affordable housing. But there's also been quite a lot around sort of environmental initiatives as well, trying to improve the environmental efficiency of existing stock. And that's one thing, obviously, that's missing from the Australian response, or certainly broadly, there are one or two initiatives around by the states. But certainly internationally, that focus on not only the lower end of the market, but the energy efficiency is really quite telling. Next slide. So have measures been successful? Well, time will tell, and I think there's some pretty strong evidence coming out now that home builder has achieved by and large what it set out to achieve. When we were doing this in sort of May, June, there wasn't that sort of evidence around. So our approach was to talk to 25 key industry stakeholders across 3 states to find out, well, what would they like to see in terms of the interventions, and home builder had just about started at that time, and did they think that was likely to be successful? And there was some very strong support for home builder and the planning reforms and the state boosts and so forth. I think certainly those working in the housing industry were very receptive and very appreciative, if you like, of a very fast response by government to keep the industry going. Of course, you had a pipeline of work coming through, but that work was going to stop without some intervention. So I think a real positive there for the speed of response, and Chris certainly talked about that as well. And that quick response did certainly lead to an increase in the demand side. And I think it also increased, particularly in Western Australia, awareness that actually now might be a good time to invest in housing or to buy housing. So it created a bit of an awareness and confidence in that market. You can see there around about 14,500 applications for home builder up to 23rd of October. It's early days yet; those numbers will go up. 79% for new build, the remainder for refurbishment, but the vast majority of those renovations have occurred in New South Wales and Victoria. I think it's generally due to the policy settings around that. So generally, yeah, great support for the measures, but there were concerns, particularly around, well, what happens at the end of the stimulus measures? These grants, these demand side measures tend to bring forward demand. They tend to create a vacuum at the end of it. So when those grants actually at the end, you've got a gap. All right, people have been brought forward their decisions, and they're not going to be buying it at that time. So what happens come mid 2021? Is there likely to be a big drop in new build construction? Will the industry require further support? And there were a lot of comments around issues around policy settings, extending the time frames because of the particular condition. I'm sure Tanya will talk about some of those, and some states, particularly in Western Australia, have listened to, I think, the concerns of industry and have made necessary adjustments. Next slide. Now, I can't possibly do a presentation without having some charts in it, so I thought I'd share with you a few of these. So building approvals are pretty much the latest data, or most up-to-date data we can get on the impact of these stimulus measures. And you can see there for Australia, there has been an uptick since the home builder in house approvals. What's concerning, of course, is the other side of things, the multi-res, that they continue to decline. There hasn't been a recovery there because the actual home builder stimulus is just not designed, the settings just will not produce a big response in that multi-residential sector. If we go through the state level ones now. So Western Australia, you can see there a very quick and a very steep response in the number of building approvals. We were coming off an extremely low base in Western Australia, but a big upturn there. Multi-res is pretty lumpy, so I'm not sure that August to September increase is going to be a trend, but certainly you can identify the big impact it had on separate house building. Next state. New South Wales, a little bit more complicated. You can see there a very different balance between houses and multi-res, and not really a great impact so far, partly due to the $750,000 price cap, which makes the home builder grant a little bit problematic. Move on to Victoria. You can see there's starting to be a response, but again, you see multi-res is still at pretty low levels. Next state. Again, bit of a response in Queensland, and then I think Tasmania or South Australia next. Again, you can see a bit of an upturn, and the same with Tasmania as well. So that provides evidence that certainly there has been an impact there, and it's desperately needed, because if we look where the construction industry or the housing industry was pre-COVID, there were problems starting to emerge. So these are dwelling completions. So stuff that's obviously dwellings that are being finished. And you can see there some drops in New South Wales and Queensland, and Western Australia has been dropping for some time, but there's still stuff coming through. The biggest problem in the next slide is dwelling commencements. So these that will feed through the system, and you can see there big drops in New South Wales. Victoria's coming off as well. Queensland's been coming down for some time. South Australia's steady as it ever is, low and steady, and Western Australia's been coming off. So you can see the big drops in activity, and COVID, the potential to accelerate further drops. So the housing industry was not struggling, but it's certainly coming off highs of 2007 and 18. You can see there at the bottom, New South Wales down almost 30% on 2 years, Western Australia down 44% on its peak of the last 5 years. So significant drops in dwelling activity, which obviously has knock-on effects to the economy. So really what we want is for that trend to be turned around, and government measures, stimulus is trying to, partly through home builders is addressing the separate house. But one of the big shortages, of course, is in that multi-residential sector, and I will talk a bit about that in the questions, I'm sure. Next slide. So will the industry need further support? So I talked about that demand gap, that vacuum, if you like, at the end of the stimulus measures, where people that perhaps would have bought in a year or two's time have brought forward their decisions. And of course, we've got an economy with elevated levels of unemployment. We've got potentially low population growth for some time, and these are really not great ingredients for the housing industry. On the plus side, we've got extremely low cost of borrowing, which may stimulate some more activity in the investment market, and obviously it's favourable for first home buyers and owner occupiers. So you've got that plus side. So the issue is just what's going to happen to that market, and it's been very resilient so far. There's been lots of doom and gloom about 20% falls that haven't materialised, but we don't know what's going to happen into 2021. But a very resilient sector, and we are seeing evidence of changes in behaviour, price increases, and price increases generally do stimulate new development activity. So I think it's a very complex picture when we're talking about additional levels of support, and I think it's quite clear in many states that support is going to be required in certain parts of the market. So, okay, the new house building market in terms of the urban fringe, if you like, is doing quite well. But what about your infill areas? What about the apartment market? Because we're really going to struggle if there's little confidence and little population growth there. But I think the key takeaway is that just one size fits all doesn't work. Home building, yeah, it was that, but it was brought in extremely quickly. But to try and stimulate other parts of the market is going to be very difficult, and that's why there's a role for social housing development to try and plug that gap. Social housing delivers similar economic benefits in terms of jobs and construction and the multiplier than private housing. Not quite as big, but still there. So not only supports construction, but delivers a social outcome, a positive social outcome as well. So it seems to me, and I don't know if anyone saw the piece on the ABC last night about the National Affordable Housing Alliance, it seems to me that everybody is in favour of a response that increases social housing, apart from the federal government, who've got the power to fund some of this. Final slide. So what are the implications for government? Well, definitely housing is an important role to play in stimulating the economy, but certainly, Chris said the $4 billion, which is federal and state combined, is dwarfed by the previous response to the GFC. So I think we've got a long way to go if we were really serious about using the housing industry as a big boost to the economic recovery. So I reckon we need about an extra 70,000 dwellings to get back to 2018, 2019 going forward. Home builder might get 30, something like that. So there's still going to be a big gap to get anywhere near past levels, and clearly social housing is one way to plug quite a bit of that gap. And certainly when we do have current grants come to the end, and when we do get that potential demand vacuum, social housing again can support the industry. As I said before, some markets will need support. Western Australia are really struggling in the private rental sector, very little supply. Obviously, an apartment product is something that helps inject supply into the economy, but there isn't support around there at the moment. So very different types. We're going to see pressure on a lot of regional areas, already seeing price growth in regional areas. So how can government work to actually create new housing supply in those areas that are under significant demand pressures? And finally, it really is a great time for tax reform to get those institutional investors into affordable housing, thinking about how we can get more build-to-rent housing as well. I think housing will prove, and certainly have proved, that it really is quite resilient. Everyone needs a house, whereas other traditional institutional investment products, your office space, your retail, a little bit more volatile. So I think the time is right for encouraging and creating the settings for that institutional investment. So let's hope there's some additional announcements and additional policy measures that will really address some of those key gaps that I've highlighted. Okay, that's it for me.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that interesting overview of the project for us today. And finally, now we turn to Tanya Steinbeck. And Tanya, we look forward to hearing your reflections on these two projects.
Thanks for that, Tom. Yeah, look, I'd like to also start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the land on which I am meeting with you all today. I'd also like to acknowledge my dog, Jack. He may make an appearance or some noise over the next 5 to 10 minutes. I apologise if that happens. So, look, thank you very much to both Chris and Stephen for those presentations. It very much reinforces, I guess, the view from UDIA, particularly in WA. We've had a phenomenal response to the impact of COVID, thanks to the home builder and the building bonus stimulus measures. But they've also had some unintended consequences. So I'll probably just touch on a few of those. And in particular, the housing policy response and the coordination of that response between the federal and the state government, following what Chris was saying before. So in reflection from a WA perspective, the federal and state government alignment on any stimulus measure is critical. So we were fortunate enough in WA for the Labor state government to recognise that over the last many years, we've been in a 40-year low prior to COVID hitting in terms of dwelling commencements here in WA. So we were already at a very critical point and requiring some sort of stimulus support before the pandemic hit, and had been advocating for that for quite some time. So the impact of COVID, I guess, helped accelerate the state government's response. In combination with the home builder and obviously the federal government recognising that across the board, unfortunately, one of the unintended consequences of WA benefiting from up to $55,000, which is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for most consumers to be able to benefit from in terms of buying a new house, the federal criteria for home builder does not match the WA state building bonus criteria. And in some ways, that's a good thing. But in terms of delivery and timeframes, it's incredibly confusing, not just for industry to be able to respond, but to the consumer, who needs to understand simplistically how they can benefit from these bonuses, get the money in the bank when there's multiple different requirements and timeframes between the federal and the state side of things. And that's one of the things that we responded to immediately and requested alignment between home builder and the building bonus here in WA. Unfortunately, that's been met with deaf ears so far. And it's something that we're continuing to work on, mainly for the benefit of the home purchaser. And one of the other sort of reflections that I had of Chris talking, and we've definitely seen this here in WA from a policy perspective, is that it appears that when we have a sense of urgency and a clear shared outcome, we can actually solve some pretty major challenges in a very short space of time. So here, obviously, we've benefited from the stimulus measures, but here in WA, we've also seen some significant planning policy amendments pass through both houses of parliament in record time, It's something that we've never seen before. So that says to me that where there's a will, there's a way. And if we can do things like that and solve some major issues, and talking before about temporarily resolving some of the homelessness issues and rough sleeping issues, then why on earth do we not put that level of intensity and focus on those types of critical issues in a normal environment? Why are we waiting for a pandemic to make this a priority? So I guess I talked about the unintended consequences of stimulus measures from a housing perspective. In WA, what we've seen is significant labour shortage. So for us to be able to deliver the houses that have come to the fore through both of these packages, we've come from such a significant low to overnight a significant high in terms of demand, and we don't have the labour to be able to deliver on the timeframes that have been put in place. The other concerns that, and this is right through the whole supply chain, so from the land development side of things, from a civil construction right through to trades and getting slabs down, we just don't have the labour to be able to deal and cope with the demand. So we were starting to see site safety issues and things that were really not going to result in a good outcome for anybody. So as a result, we spent a lot of time working collaboratively with HIA and other industry bodies to get an extension to the timeframes for the building bonus. On that basis, it was unsustainable and we were unable to respond. We just needed more time to be able to deliver. We were successful in that. The state government listened to us, which was fantastic. So we now have more time to deliver in a safe way. What we're now hoping is that the federal government will come to the party and align their timeframes to match, so that we're not, we're not confusing the issue with our consumers. We're probably also fortunate in WA in that we're able to leverage the political cycle. So we're heading towards a state election in March 2021, and I think it would be I guess naive not to consider any of these sorts of decisions and policy decisions without the political lens over it, whether we like it or not. I think that always influences how quickly things happen and the scale of which things are rolled out. I would agree with Stephen in terms of one size does not fit all when it comes to stimulus measures in the housing market. Our markets are all very, very different. We're at different. WA always seems to be counter-cyclical to the eastern states, and we've seen differing levels of uptake in terms of home builder across Australia, and unfortunately, as Stephen mentioned before, the price caps put on home builder really restricted, particularly though the take up in New South Wales. So coming back to, I guess, what I tend to agree, I think social housing investment is an absolutely critical component of a recovery. We've been fortunate here that we've had some social housing investment in WA, and I see that some other states have done that as well. But from a policy perspective, what concerns me, particularly from a WA perspective, is that probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, the state government launched a state housing strategy. So they have a high level strategy that they've put together that addresses all areas of all pinch points across the housing continuum over sort of a 10-year plus period. Thank you, Stephen. That's the WA housing strategy. What concerns me though is that these and the stimulus measures, whilst the timing may have been out slightly, doesn't necessarily connect to, support or integrate with the bigger picture housing strategy over the next 10 years that is also not funded through the state budget presently. So my concern is we're going to get a bit of a patchwork sort of approach to addressing bits and pieces of the housing continuum because of the sense of urgency of COVID and the impacts of the pandemic. I think we also need to be looking at the infrastructure spend across the country. In WA, our state budget recently, they announced a $27 billion record investment in infrastructure over the forward estimates, which is absolutely incredible amount of money. But we also need to look at housing to leverage that infrastructure. And there's not an equivalent or a supporting commitment at this point to be able to do that. Going to build to rent, and I would reinforce what Stephen was saying before. One of the most critical issues that we're facing now in WA is a rental vacancy rate of 0.08%. It's practically nothing. So we are seeing price pressure on rents. We're seeing, 60, 70 people lining up for, just to apply for a rental at the moment. And it's there's no sign of that ending anytime soon. We also have a moratorium on evictions that doesn't end until the end of March. So what has been completely absent from the market that is really starting to bite is investors. We haven't seen investors active in the market here for a very long time. So we just don't have the rental stock. That is going to be a massive issue for us here. So we need to be looking at ways where we could potentially counteract that in the very short term. One of the things that we're looking at here is we also have an incentive here for stamp duty rebates on apartments that are off the plan or under construction. So they get 75% stamp duty rebate. What that's done is it's it's skewed the apartment market towards off the plan and under construction sales. So what we've got now is around 2,000 apartments that are new, that have been sitting there, that no one will touch because the incentive isn't there to buy completed apartments. So we've got legacy stock sitting there, 2,000 apartments empty, and we have a rental crisis. So what we're looking at now is, well, with our members, our developers, what can we do to free up that completed stock to investors to get rental stock back on the market quickly, so that we actually have a potential immediate to short-term solution to the vacancy issue. And at a sort of medium term, I guess it comes back to only incentivising the house and land in greenfields areas versus infill and apartments, because of the nature of the stimulus measures and the timeframes that were put on that. So that's kind of a couple of quick things. The other sort of interesting thing that we've literally just completed is we've gone around nationally through UDIA and interviewed all of our developer members to find out exactly what the impact of home builder has been on construction pipelines and the trajectory into 2021 if it was to end. This was at the request of Michael Sukkar, who wanted to know, sort of, and get a feel of what is actually happening on the ground now, because there tends to be a bit of lag in the data. Over 91% of the industry saw an increase in average monthly sales from June to September once home builder was announced, and over half of all respondents enjoyed a jump of more than 50%, which is amazing. I guess the key thing from our perspective as well is that as a country, Australia is facing a sustained downturn in immigration and population growth due to COVID. And generally that fuels a lot of our economic prosperity and demand for new housing construction. So back in September, when we put a submission in to the federal government, we worked with Urbis and looked at, I guess, the net overseas migration that accounts for 56% of Australia's dwelling demand, with natural domestic population increases accounting for 44%. So on average per annum, we're potentially facing a reduction of over 50,000 homes per year that will occur in the number of new homes being constructed over the next 5 years. And that translates to 17.9 billion less gross value added being contributed to the Australian economy. So it's a substantial issue and one that I think justifies an extension to home builder. But we also need to look at the criteria and take our time, as sort of Chris and Stephen spoke about previously, to get that criteria right and to not apply a one-size-fits-all approach to every market, because it's just not going to work, not to the extent that we want it to anyway. So that's probably it from me, but happy to, take any other questions.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Some interesting extra ideas thrown into the mix there as well. Thank you very much. Look, we've now got a bit of time to have a bit of discussion together, and I've received a few questions from the audience listening, which I'll sort of gather up and gradually pass on. But I just want to begin with going back to you, Chris, and just very quickly, you provided a wonderful overview of what's happened in Australia. Are you able to position the policy response that we've seen here in an international context, and what is missing from our response, or is it very similar?
No, I think the Australian response has been excellent. If you compare it anecdotally with what's happening overseas, in general, in government approaches to dealing with the pandemic and the public health crisis, Australia responded extremely quickly across the board, not just within the housing system, but recognising, of course, the interconnectedness of the housing system with other parts of people's everyday lives and the economy. So although there was a somewhat slow start to change and interventions around February, I just feel that if you compare it with overseas, you just have to open the newspaper every day to see how Australia has been more proactive and intervened with considerable resources, and now we're finding at different levels and across different states, of course, the picture is still largely similar, that while our control of coronavirus more broadly is very good compared to the rest of the world, we should also reflect that politicians and policymakers are up there to take a lot of stick from people from the outside looking in. And I think in this case, although it's obviously not perfect and there are remaining problems, they did back themselves and they backed the system to intervene. So I can't throw any data at you to prove that. I don't think it exists yet, or no one's captured it. That could be Stephen's next project or mine. But I think Australia has shown that its systems are durable and that its housing system can respond to interventions really well. But as Tanya mentioned, why do we have to wait for a crisis to show how well this can work? And I think there's another opportunity to lead from the front globally and show how, in this case, the housing system can be perhaps rethought or reappraised and evaluated to show what works really well outside of a crisis, and to see if we can sustain that.
Great, thanks, Chris. Stephen, to you, you spoke quite a lot about stimulus when you were presenting your project. Can you just have a little bit of provide a little bit of clarity around that idea of stimulus? I mean, to what extent, what makes something a stimulus, and what differentiates that from, say, a measure to support or protect an industry or a pipeline of housing projects, for example?
Well, the federal government wouldn't call home builder a stimulus. I can't remember the phrase that they use, but it isn't stimulus. But my view, anything that creates demand where it wouldn't necessarily have existed before through chucking cash at people is pretty much a stimulus. We're incentivizing you to go out and build a dwelling. We're providing you with the funds to do so, which didn't previously exist, and we're doing this in order to increase activity. So I would categorize that as a stimulus. Rather, a lot of the intervention that Chris has talked about is about support. It's ensuring people continue what they're currently doing and are able to remain in the private rental market, rather than doing something new and different. So that's how I sort of term the stimulus. It's providing an incentive for someone to undertake an activity that they wouldn't have otherwise have done. So you're creating new activity. So I mean, as Tanya has reported there, I mean, it's obviously been very successful in creating work for the industry that wouldn't otherwise have been there. And of course, if that work wasn't there, the jobs wouldn't be there either. So that demand side stimulus, creating incentives for consumers to spend, is supporting jobs.
And just staying with you for a second, Stephen, too, there's been a question around the multiplier effect of this type of investment, and particularly the question is asking around about the difference of the different type of multiplier that might apply by investing in social housing production versus investing in in market housing provision. The question, unless I've misunderstood it, is actually anticipating that a market-focused investment is going to be more effective in achieving a return on a dollar spent. Can you maybe make some comparison about the type of multiplier effect that investment in different parts of the housing system, particularly social versus market housing, can have?
But I think there's been some work in the UK that shows that the social housing multiplier is slightly lower. The reason being, you don't get the onward spend that you would get in the private sector. So think of somebody who is building a house, and then obviously will furnish that house and maybe do the garden, all those sort of things. So creating jobs for a broad range of people in the community. Whereas social housing, you don't get that level of onward spend, not to that same extent. So the multiplier is slightly lower, but still a massive contribution to the economy through creating those direct and indirect jobs. So yeah, it's still an extremely effective way of stimulus, but just slightly lower multipliers in the private sector. And again, because of the rate of spend after the construction side of things. And of course, the social housing dwellings might be a little bit smaller. You might not get your 230 square metre social housing 4x2 bedroom dwelling like you will do in the private sector here. So perhaps you don't get that exact level of spend to the construction itself.
Thanks. Chris, just back to you quickly. There's a question which is perhaps a bit more of a comment, suggesting that maybe some of the intervention, particularly around response to homelessness and what happened in Victoria, for example, which you highlighted, that maybe this perhaps wasn't always as successful as it might have been. That for example, people were accommodated in places where they didn't have cooking facilities and so forth. I mean, maybe this, as I say, it's a bit more of a comment, but maybe this gets to, I guess, that distinction you were making between a bird's eye versus a worm's eye view. Are you able to just provide maybe a little bit more in relation to the response to homelessness, particularly in the Victorian context?
Yeah, it is a bit more of a comment, I suppose, and that's true. It runs the risk of taking a bird's eye view of glossing over the realities and many different experiences that people have had through the response to homelessness and rough sleeping in Victoria. So I mean, I acknowledge that, of course. I think overall, though, I think what we've probably exposed, and I don't want to get too academic about it, but by really looking at, say, the response to homelessness in Victoria and looking at the system, what we're really asking is, to what extent is this anti-fragile? To what extent, when you apply a shock to the system, what falls over and what stays, and what stayed and what's exposed as missing? So if you take the initiative and work done by Launch Housing around the response to rough sleepers, they rehumanised people who are rough sleeping by using it as an opportunity to collect information about those individuals, about their names and who they were. And I reflect on that part of the experience and think, there are so many missing parts to this that the response has actually helped to bring people back into the system by acknowledging that they exist and that they do have access, or should have access, not just to crisis accommodation, but moving forward, we need to be able to work with them and help them longer term. Were there mistakes made? I think we all know that in Victoria there were serious mistakes made throughout the response to the pandemic. And so in response to a comment, I've probably given you a very wishy-washy answer. So my apologies to whoever left that, comment.
All right, I'm going to segue now to the question of build-to-rent housing. I think you raised that, Tanya, and maybe you can go first in terms of talking about that. What is its potential in this context, and how can it be used to ensure that there is a supply of affordable housing?
No, so it's a really interesting proposition, build to rent, and in New South Wales they've sort of making some changes around the taxation settings around build to rent to make that a more viable proposition. moving forward. And that's something that I think in Western Australia we're watching very, very closely. We have had one development in WA go to market so far for build to rent, but it isn't at the affordable end. It's very much at the more premium end of the market. And this is one of the challenges that I think from our developers are facing, is that they can't, that it's not feasible, it's not financially feasible to roll out a build to rent product at the moment under the current taxation settings for anything less than a more premium product, because you just can't get the return. So there needs to be you know, a significant amount of effort put into looking at both federally and at a state level how we can actually incentivise the development of build to rent, including the you know, the affordable housing component of that. And perhaps even look at you know, state government or federal government investment in leading the way in delivering build to rent. I mean, you know, the state government in the delivery of public housing, that's kind of the ultimate build to rent model, right? But it's we need to have a look at how we can leverage institutional investment and private sector investment to be able to deliver that sort of product. And at the moment, the way that it's structured, it's not feasible in the vast majority of cases. So yeah, I think it's an area, and it's unfortunately it's not a quick fix. This isn't going to be something that we're going to be able to use necessarily to respond in 6 or 12 months time. But what it will do is help ensure supply of affordable rentals in the sort of medium to longer term, as it does become, you know, more and more of an issue.
What do you think, Stephen?
I think we're kidding ourselves if we think build to rent is the answer to affordable rental housing. It's just not going to happen. As Tanya said, it's just not viable to do so. Even when you do alter the tax settings to be more favourable, your typical build to rent is going to be targeted towards that medium to upper portion of the private rental market, unless there's some form of subsidy coming from government, and that can be through the land or a partnership, something like that. What I'd like to see is build to rent where the community housing sector get involved as well. So you have a proportion of the units actually for the community or for community housing providers. And so at least you get some social housing element there. But given the returns available from rents, you do need some further subsidy in there. But of course, you know, actually having some rental stock is better than nothing, and it does have knock-on effects throughout the rental market. But I think the case in Western Australia highlights how very different the rental market is across the country. So you've got a situation in several states, Western Australia, Tasmania, for example, where vacancy rates are very low, but then you've got increasing vacancy rates in New South Wales and Victoria because of a lack of, or partly because of a lack of international students. But I think there's one thing common about build to rent is it will provide, hopefully, should provide high quality professionally managed stock, and you know, we desperately need that in every private rental market.
Thanks. Chris, I'll come back to you and ask, to what extent are the lessons that we've had from the pandemic response more to do with ways of working rather than necessarily what to do? Has what we've seen helped us understand better how we should be going about things, perhaps, rather than specifically what needs to be done?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I'm sort of in this limbo zone between looking at this as a system and relying on the system and expecting it to work, and then recognizing that people run that system, and that without the people working together in ways that might also follow the rules in use rather than the stated rules are critically important to seeing the thing get done. I mean, my lesson I'm taking from the research we've done is that seeing the crisis shows people, I think maybe it reinvigorates people to see what can be done in terms of the response to the crisis and on the effects of that on the housing system. In terms of what should be done, that's more problematic, because that involves a series of political actors and a series of commitments beyond the scope of what we've done. So that concerns me a little bit, simply because what we're dealing with is sorry, my young daughter has come in to talk to you as well. We have dogs and daughters. There we are. The beauty of lockdown or post-lockdown. So I'm on both sides of the fence on that one. I think the great thing from it is what we didn't really have before was evidence that this is how it could be done, and what it sees to me, being the eternal optimist that I am, is an opportunity for all parties to come together. And I'm glad Steve mentioned community housing organisations as well as part of this. This is a conversation about how to re-engineer not just a process, but what our expectations are around delivering a fairer housing system for as many Australians as, well, for all Australians, quite frankly.
Interesting you mentioned community housing. One of our other participants has contributed a comment around, I guess, disaggregating community and public housing, rather than talking about social housing, talking about those two forms of social housing quite distinctly, because obviously they are procured in very different ways. Just really quickly, is there do they take a different role in a situation of economic recovery?
Well, look, yeah, they are different products, really. Public housing is a different product from the community housing provided sector. And what I'd like to see is that investment in broadly social housing, certainly aiding the growth of community housing providers. And we've seen that in before with social housing initiative. There were a lot of units that were transferred to the community housing sector, allowing them to grow, while some units are retained by housing authorities as public housing. So you still need that financial commitment to start with, to try and not only grow the size of the public housing stock, but also then to allow the community housing sector to grow. And we've seen in Western Australia some money being pumped into social housing, but it tends to be in the public housing space. There doesn't tend to be the support for the community housing sector at the state level, which is unfortunate. So I think there really needs to be a balance there, but you still got to construct dwellings, so it still has that same stimulus impact. You've just got a slightly different outcome at the end of it. So in terms of stimulus, yeah, they're both equally important.
Thanks. Now, just going quickly to the issue that a number of you have raised, where planning processes were perhaps speeded up, or planning regulations potentially relaxed in different parts of the country as part of the response. Just on that, and to what extent do we think that has been effective, and have we measured that? I know, Tanya, you said that was something that was very enthusiastically received by the sector, and I guess there's no surprise there, but to what extent can we, I guess, quantify the benefit that that's brought? What would be involved in understanding that? And one of our participants has also asked about that in relation to community housing as well, and whether we also need a planning intervention to help with that, assist in that its provision.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. So the main, I guess, driver behind the changes to the Planning and Development Act in WA was job creation and economic activity. So what they did here was, I guess, the core part of the amendments was the creation of a significant development assessment unit. So that's for any project over the value of $50 million. 50 million, yeah, and less than 5 million or up to 5 million in the regions would be eligible for consideration by a specific unit set up to, they won't call it fast track, but a better coordinated assessment and approval process for projects that are able to be delivered within a certain time frame, that have a certain, I guess, economic dividend attached to those projects. So that could be a range of different ones. The first one was just approved last week, and it's a LNG plant. But there's a whole range of other developments that are now going through that process, mixed-use developments, resi, industrial, etc. So I guess what it has done and I'll get to the community housing side at the moment, it's actually fast-tracked planning reform that was always there, but not prioritised. And so what the industry always wants is better coordinated and faster approvals and assessments. This is what this particular planning amendment, the bill created. We are yet to see that actually come to fruition. We've only seen that one project go through the system so far. There's a whole range of projects that need to come into that. In terms of how you would assess the success of that, I think we'd have to have a look at that in contrast to the process that is already in place prior to COVID, which is called a joint development assessment panel. That's generally how these sorts of projects would be approved, and the difference in terms of timeframes for approval and assessment, but then also ultimately what was the total number of jobs created as a result of these projects, and the subsequent economic activity created, so that you can measure the impact of this particular reform aspect. In terms of community housing, I think that's a really good question. I think we'd have to take a bit more of a detailed look in terms of where are the key challenges in terms of planning from a community housing perspective, and what needs to be done to sort of unlock, land and housing approvals in that space. In WA, we have a situation where a lot of planning approvals, the Housing Authority actually has planning authority to be able to make some of those decisions without going to the Planning Commission, depending on what it is. So yeah, I think it requires a little bit more work. I think and it needs to be framed in the context of job creation and economic activity for the broader benefit of the community in a community housing perspective. But at the moment, the reason why those reforms were fast-tracked was because of job creation ultimately, and if it can be framed in that way, then I think, absolutely that's something they should definitely look at.
Thank you. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, so I'm going to have to apologise to the people who've submitted questions in the last couple of minutes that we're not going to be able to get to those. I guess just one final question to the panel, and if you can, I guess, be very quick in terms of responding into it, as our time is running out. But does the opportunity, as well as we're dealing here with a significant crisis, and we're responding to that because we need to I guess, set ourselves up for an effective recovery. But is there also an opportunity here to look at, I guess, system-wide reform and change to how we do things? Will we just return to business as usual? Should we just return to business as usual? Should we see this as an opportunity to introduce other things as well? Just very quickly from anyone who'd like to respond to that.
I'll pitch in first. But no, sorry, Stephen. Stephen says yes. I
yes
say
too.
We don't know what.
Yes to all of it. Yes, let's do things differently. It's opportunities for further reform.
Yeah, should we go back to business as usual? Well, no, and that would never be possible after this pandemic. That just isn't even on the table. Things have changed irrevocably, and that just won't change. But we do have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to gather the evidence to inform policy making, but also to listen. I think there's got to be a deep amount of understanding and learning from the sector more broadly, and from beneficiaries, about what's worked, what fails, and how do we have a system that's fairer across the board.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with you, Chris and Stephen. If there was ever a time that we should be working collaboratively on particularly housing across the continuum, now's the time to do that. And I think even the National Cabinet has proved that the level of collaboration and coordination can be very beneficial. Housing needs to be elevated to a level that it warrants that sort of discussion and prioritisation. Because unfortunately, I just think job seeker and job keeper ends where it's only going to get harder, and I don't think we should wait until that happens before we have a plan.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much to our three speakers today, and also thank you everyone at home or in the office or wherever you are joining us today. We appreciate you joining us. And I just want, before we finish the broadcast, to mention that our next webinar is coming up just next week, Friday the 27th of November at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be joined by Professor Emma Baker of the University of Adelaide, and she'll be presenting findings from the AHURI project, Renting in the Time of COVID-19, Understanding the Impacts. And we'll also be joined by Dr. David Oswald from RMIT University in Melbourne, where he will be presenting findings from the AHURI project, Post-Pandemic Landlord-Renter Relationships in Australia. Also joining that discussion will be Leo Patterson-Ross, Chief Executive Officer of the Tenants Union of New South Wales, who will be responding to those projects. Okay, that webinar is coming up next week, as I said, so please, if you would like to attend that, get quickly onto making a booking for that. And I also will point out that actually we're fairly solidly packed with a whole range of webinar events between now and the end of the year. We're, I think, running one weekly, and that's in order to present the, I guess, the breadth and the extent of the AHURI research that has been coming out over the last few months, particularly those associated with the COVID research agenda. All of those webinars for the rest of the year are now available for registration via the website. So please take a look at what's on offer and plan your attendance for the remainder of the year. Finally, I'd also like to remind you that our 2020 National Homelessness Conference is coming up on the 1st and 2nd of December. It was meant to be in Canberra in August, and obviously that didn't go ahead, but we'll be running it as an online conference, and it will adopt the theme appropriately, the year that changed homelessness. And it will examine how the pandemic has impacted people who have experienced or have been at risk of homelessness, as well as the policy and the practice responses during this unprecedented year. So I do urge you to register for the conference as well. The program's growing every day, and we have a great lineup of local and also international speakers and participants in the conference. I guess the online nature of the conference means we can get a lot more from overseas participation as well. So just a quick reminder in closing that we'd appreciate your feedback today by completing the survey that will be sent to you shortly. And again, if you want to share the webinar with colleagues, it will be available on our website, hopefully later today. So thank you once again, and until we see you in person or at our next webinar, thank you for joining us. Goodbye.